So you finally finished up your desktop design. It looks great and you're ready to just put it into production, then rock and roll. But there's an issue, a big one. We have only designed for one device, which means that we still have 66% at least of the puzzle to go. What does the design look like on mobile or on a tablet or on a TV? Thou shall not worry. In this video, we'll cover how you turn your desktop design into tablet and mobile responsive designs in Figma. Hey all, if you haven't seen me before, my name is Tim and I'm a product designer based in Stockholm, Sweden. Now today we'll talk about responsive design and we'll start by actually looking at real world examples like Apple and Figma and see how they do responsive design. Then we'll take those learnings, go into Figma and see how we can implement it in the software as well. Now make sure you stick till the end because both the real world examples and the Figma tutorial are going to be equally important. Let's get started. Now, the first thing we should address when it comes to responsive design on the web is that everything is contextual. So depending on what design you have, what design needs you have, the layout, the breakpoints where your layout changes responsively is going to be different. So if we take a look at Figma's website here, I have the inspector mode so that we can see exactly at which pixels we change the layout. So if I resize this, you can see that around 1250, something happens with the navbar. We take away the links, we get this hamburger menu. Then at 700, 800 something, we have something else happening. This text here, the heading is decreased in size. And then you can see that this image here constantly decreases in size. And at, let's see here, at around 540 maybe, this text decreases in size again. Now, let's go to Apple and see what happens here. So keep an eye here. Okay, we decrease the size. They don't change the layout until 1050, 1060 pixels, 1070 even. That's the first. So they change the size of the text. This size of this container is changed. Then at 800 something, this navbar is changed. And at 730 maybe, we change this layout again. So we stack these elements on top of each other instead. So you can see that it's very, very contextual. Now let's head back to Figma for a quick moment and look at their navbar because I thought this was interesting. And this is a point I wanted to make as well, that the lower you go with your breakpoints and the more breakpoints you have, the more accurate or the better your design is typically going to look for the different sizes. So if we click on the hamburger menu here, you can see that Figma has really made it easy for themselves. They have this really tight mobile ready menu already at 1200 pixels. Now, some designs, some websites will probably have different menus for different screen sizes, but Figma has the same all the way through here. And it's nothing wrong with that, but yeah, depending on how many you have, maybe the better your design is going to look, but it's also more work, of course. Another thing I want to point to here, if we look at the Figma example, is that if we take a look at this section here, we have some text and a call to action, and we have an animation here to the right. Now, if we decrease the size here, decrease it, then they're gonna stack on top of each other. That's a typical pattern when we go down in sizes. But you can see here as well that the order changed. So now this, that was to the left, the text section, is beneath the animation. And that's because the animation is going to tell the story or get the point through better than just the text. So they want to show the animation first because that's what gets the point through. Something else that is worth mentioning is that some things will depend on a column grid, and some things will depend on a max width. So if we take a look at this, for example, this title and the text here, when we decrease the size, you can see that this remains intact in terms of width. So nothing happens here. Like, it's not dynamic depending on the width of my frame or my screen size. And then when we go down here, you can see how here it changes a bit and then it snaps to a new container. So this is the new max width, but it stays intact. And here, a new max width, but now it's 100% of the width. So that's something that is typically done with text, where you want it to maintain the same kind of width, because text, we're reading it, we want it to not be too long and not too narrow. So typically we would use max width for that. Something else when it comes to responsive design is when you go through these different breakpoints, usually you will change the size of things, right? So if we look at Apple here, and they're going to be an outlier in this case, we decrease the size, but you can see at this breakpoint, so the first breakpoint, nothing happens to their button sizes. The text sizes change, the size of the images change, but the buttons and the links stay the same. Let's see at the next breakpoint, same thing. Buttons and links stay the same in terms of size. If we look at Figma, nothing happens at this breakpoint. Nothing happens here. But at this breakpoint, where we kind of come to the mobile breakpoint, we decrease the button size. So again, very contextual. How much space do you need in your design? It is all depending on what you're trying to achieve, what kinds of elements you're using, how much text is it, etc. And what you've seen here is that we typically have 2 to 3 breakpoints. So the full scale thing here, desktop, then we have something that happens for tablet, and then typically something that happens, or a breakpoint that happens for mobile. Now let's jump into Figma and see how we can use these learnings to create some designs ourselves. By the way, if you want to follow along here, you can just grab the Figma file in the description below. Now, what you see on the canvas here is a design that is made into different breakpoints. I usually start with desktop because I feel that that's the viewport where you're going to have the most things happening. You're going to have the most animations, the most complex illustrations. Some of these things might disappear on mobile. So that's why I usually do the biggest design first and then I work my way down. Now let's look into these specific cases. Let's start with desktop. When it comes to column grids, we usually use the 12-8-4 standard. So 12 columns for desktop, 8 columns for tablet or breakpoint 1, and then 4 columns for mobile or breakpoint 2 as I call it. And these different column grids have some different properties depending on the breakpoint. So if we click into desktop here, we go to the right sidebar, we see layout grid, I click on this, and I've chosen columns. The thing you get when you just click plus here, if you haven't created one, you're gonna get grid. So we go from grid to column. In here, you can see the count is 12. The type is stretch. And we're going to get into this when we look at the widescreen, the difference between stretch and the other alternatives. The margin here is set to 167. This is an arbitrary number. It all depends on the container size that we want to have for our layout. We'll get to that as well. The gutter size is going to be the distance between your columns. So the white space here. If we go to tablet, you can see we have a count of 8, we have type stretch, we have margin 32 pixels, and we have a gutter of 24 pixels. So the gutter decreases here. And that's something you can have as a general rule. The smaller the screen size, the smaller the margin is going to be, and the smaller the gutter is going to be. If we go to breakpoint number 2, and this is where we go into mobile design, you can see if we click in here that we have 4 columns, we have a margin of 24 pixels instead of 32, and we have a gutter of 16 pixels. So this decreases for mobile as well. And the narrow one here is just for us to test the edge case, like what happens to our design in the smallest of cases. So we want to make sure that it doesn't look wonky when it's on tiny mobile screens. Now with that context, let's jump back just to wide here for a second. Because for wide, we're using, instead of stretch here, we're using center. And you could use center for desktop as well, because usually at 1440 pixels here, which is like just the typical desktop size, it's actually, if you hit A and you go to desktop in Figma, desktop is 1440 pixels in width. And the same goes for the breakpoint here. It's arbitrary, but I usually go for a middle ground around 1000 pixels. And when it comes to mobile, this also depends on how far down can you go before the layout breaks. So maybe you have to have your second breakpoint at 800, or you can go all the way down to 400 before you need to actually change the layout. Let's go back to wide here for a second. So if we look here, we go into it, we see that it's center. And this is because when you use center, you actually cap the container size or the column grid size. When you have stretch, it stretches with your frame. So just because we have a screen this big doesn't mean that we want to utilize all the horizontal spacing, because if this would stretch all the way to the edges, then the text would be very unreadable, because you want to cap text to a certain width for it to be as readable as possible, and things would just be too spread out. So you want to cap it in a container like this. Now, with this knowledge, let's jump over and start creating stuff. Like I mentioned before, I usually start with desktop. So let's start there. I'll click on the frame. I'll hit layout grid, change it to columns, do 12 in terms of count, and I'll add a little rectangle here, set it to 1140, center it, and then I'll map this layout grid according to that rectangle. So 150 seems to be the number here. I'll change the gutter to be 30. And this is just an arbitrary number. You choose, depending on your design, what you need. Now let's move down here and grab this. Just take this container with these two, and let's put them onto our canvas. So the text element and this image. Now we can remove this. Depending on what you want to achieve here, you can go different routes. So in this case, for the sake of the tutorial, let's say we want both of these to adhere to our column grid. Like I mentioned when we talked about the real websites, in some cases you might want something to be, so for example, this text, you might want that to be set in a fixed width, like have a max width or a min width, or just width. And the image here should be the thing responsive when we decrease the size of the frame or the browser. In this case, let's say that both of them are gonna adhere to the column grid. So I'll take this, and I'll just increase the size a bit. I'll make sure that everything within this container is set to fill. So fill. This doesn't matter. We want this to be cut off. So maybe we want to have this fixed, so that's fine. But everything else should be set to fill. And the outer container should be set to fixed. But our constraint settings should say left and right, because if we set that to left and right, and now we start decreasing or increasing the size, you can see how the container is adhering to our column grid. So no matter how much we stretch it, it's gonna follow. So for the image here as well, it should be set to left and right. Now, if we decrease the size, it adheres to the column grid. Nice. So this is gonna be how it behaves before it reaches breakpoint 1. With that set, let's move these over to breakpoint 1. And let's go in here and first off, set up the column layout. Like I said, 12, 8, 4. So this is going to be 8. We're going to set the margin to be 32. That's a pretty typical margin for a tablet or a breakpoint 1. Maybe the gutter could be 24. And let's look at the example we had. So here we have it centered. And here we have a difference. You can see that the width here is set to 1550 and it goes outside of the columns. So this is going to be set to a max width, which means that this shouldn't be left and right anymore and shouldn't be adhering to the columns. Let's increase the size a bit. Let's move this down. I'll change the width of this to 1550. I'll center it. I'll center all of the text in here as well. And these items should also be centered. This, let's see here. Yeah, this should be one row instead of two rows. So I'll just say hug contents. The image, this image seems like it's going to be adhering to the column grid, right? So I'll change the size of this, make it go all the way there. Maybe we'll set a fixed height of 450. And it can still be left and right here. This should not be left and right, like I said. So this text box here, so I'll set it to be aligned to the top and center. This one should be left and right, and top is fine. We'll set a distance, maybe, let's say 72 pixels. Decrease the size a bit, like that. Now, if we shrink it, it behaves in the way that we want. Awesome. So that's breakpoint 1. Breakpoint number 2. Let me copy it over again. Click the content here. Increase the size a bit. So what happens here? Okay, so now this seems to be taking up the full width. So it's adhering to the columns at this breakpoint. This doesn't change really. Maybe the sizing changes. But other than that, I think we're pretty much doing the same thing. So let's first add a layout grid. We'll say columns, count 4. The margin, as I said before, decreases the lower we go. So we had 32, let's say 24. And the gutter was 24, so let's say 16 here. I'll increase the width so that it covers all of the columns. And we'll change this to be left and right. And we'll set it to be top. Still works. This image shrinks a bit. And put it a bit closer, 56 pixels maybe. Something like that. Decrease it in height. Change the height of the whole entire thing. And now if we just drag it up, yep, that works. Now you can see that the distance here becomes huge if we would want them to stay together at a fixed interval or a fixed pixel distance. We could add an auto layout, set this auto layout to be left and right. First we need to do that. Set it to left and right. Now they're going to maintain this distance. So if I drag it out here, you can see that the distance between our elements is maintained. And like I said, with the narrow screen, it's just a replica that is going to be there for us to make sure that it works for smaller devices. One thing that I forgot to do is I forgot to decrease the size of the text, and maybe we want to decrease the size of the buttons as well, and the text within the buttons, maybe something like that. Because that's usually what happens when you go from desktop to tablet. You can either go down in sizes there, you don't have to, but usually when you go from tablet to mobile, that's when you really have to consider going down in sizes, at least in terms of text and buttons and input fields and elements like that, because they might be very big on desktop and they're not really going to fit for a small narrow screen like this in that case. So I'll bring this over here, decrease the width. Let's take this breakpoint here. Let's copy the column grid like that. And let's decrease the width a bit more so that it's aligned properly. And wait a second, I forgot to do something here, I think. Yeah, so this is the same layout. In code, what we could say is that once we get to a point where this doesn't fit anymore, then we're going to wrap the content, which means that this text is going to be put underneath the button. Now, Figma doesn't allow you to do this, but let's imagine it's code, so it does that automatically like that. And this text is going to have to be fill container instead of hug, and we're going to center the text as well. All right, so now with this in mind, let's go back to the full pages here and see if we can make sense of how everything is done, and see if we can find these common patterns that we're using and if it's consistent across the board. So let's start with this one. We have a feature section with 3 features. Each of them take up 4 columns. So I guess they're going to be adhering to the column layout in this case. If we go here, they take up the full width, so they take up the 8 columns in this case, but they don't adhere to the column layouts per se, or the actual columns, because 8 is not divisible by 3. So in this case, then we have to make the container take up the full space, and these will take up the space they can within the container. If we go here, we change to a vertical stacking layout instead. And the same for this narrow screen, which makes sense because they're the same. Narrow is just taking breakpoint 2 and giving us an edge case, a visualization of what it looks like in kind of the worst case. Back to this section, we have an image that adheres to the column layout. It takes up 6 columns. Then we have a column in spacing and 5 columns for this text container. Now, let's see what happens when we go down a notch. So here we have the second breakpoint, and here we vertically align stuff. So we put the image in the top, which I guess means that this image is the most important thing, or the most attention-grabbing thing that we want to show first. We actually horizontally align or stack the text here. So the title takes up 3 columns, then we have 1 column in space, and then we have the rest of the text being right aligned here, taking up 4 columns. So I guess these would also be adhering to the column system because they take up the exact space of the columns. Now for the next one, we go back to vertically stacking the text, but the rest of the layout looks the same, and of course the same for narrow in this case. If we go to this one with the cards, the testimonial cards, they each take up 4 columns. So I'm guessing they'll be adhering to the column grid. If we go here, they don't take up 4 columns each because it's now 8 columns. 8 is not divisible by 3 once again. So we have the container take up the full width, and then these are spaced to take up whatever width they can. And when we come to the second breakpoint, that's where something happens. Now we have some kind of carousel instead. So we might even have set a width for the card. So this is maybe going to be a max width of 325 pixels, and it's going to be the same for each of these cards. And the same thing here. Now in this case, we might want to add some things like some carousel dot indicators or something, because it's kind of hard to see this card. Let's jump back to this section. Okay, so we have a fixed width. So this is not adhering to the column layout. Let's see what happens here. Same thing, same max width. And here it actually changes to take up the full space instead. We could still have a max width at this point, but I think if we're going to have that, we have to communicate that to developers looking at our files. This is the easy way to handle it, because now from this breakpoint, it's just going to be adhering to the column layout all the way down to super small sizes. And the last one would be the footer, which also looks to be adhering to this column layout. So the brand here is taking up 2 columns. Each of these is taking up 2 columns each, and then we have this subscribe container that takes up 4 columns. Now in this layout, once again, it's 8, so we could divide it by 4, I guess, because we have 4 elements here, but instead we have this container taking up 5 columns, and this one taking up 3 columns. So when we would decrease in size here, this would shrink and this would shrink. So it would shrink accordingly. And the brand being on top instead. Now here something happens. This gets its own row. So this link container gets its own row, and the subscription or subscribe container gets its own row. We can see that this is not adhering to the column layout, which means that we then have some form of a max or min width that we're playing around with here. And in this case, yeah, so this has to be a max width, because in this case, it's taking up 100% of the width. Now, this isn't really possible to recreate in Figma, but when we decrease the size of our browser, or we just have a smaller device, and this is set to max width, then once we creep up on this subscribe input field, then it's gonna adhere to the full section width instead. So then it would look like this. Now, if you're interested in more Figma tutorials like this, leave a comment below and let us know. See you soon.